Look, I get it. You just closed a major case. And things with your mother are complicated. And hey, you found the swordsman, and believe me, we are grateful and in no position to ask for a favor. But there's a killer taking us out one by one, so we need Cassandra Killjoy to get back to work. Did you know that the original Avengers movie was supposed to include Ant-Man and the Wasp and a second villain? Unfortunately, that version of the movie was just not meant to be, and it has faded away into nothing more than one of the legends of fandom. Greetings, fanboys and fangirls. I'm Erod, and I'm the Blockbuster Buster, and welcome to Legends of Fandom, where we talk about the fanboy films and shows that almost happened. Now, for you to understand how this version of the Avengers almost happened, you have to understand the original plan for the MCU. Originally, the plan was pretty straightforward, which was for the first movie to feature the same lineup of heroes as the first comic. And for those of you who don't know, that lineup was Iron Man, Thor, Hulk, Ant-Man, and the Wasp, plus Captain America, who doesn't show up until issue 4, but that is when the comic officially found its rhythm, and Cap became so integral to the team that it's hard to imagine the Avengers without him. So the plan for Phase 1 was pretty much the same, to introduce each character in their own solo movie, and then have them officially cross over in the Avengers. However, the lineup of movies would have been a bit different, and instead of Iron Man 2, we would have gotten an Ant-Man movie, directed by the great Edgar Wright, which would have presumably still starred Paul Rudd as Scott Lang, aka Ant-Man. However, it is highly unlikely that Evangeline Lilly would have still played Hope Van Dyne, because if Joss Whedon, the co-writer and director of the Avengers, would have had anything to say about it, and back then he had a lot of say, Hope Van Dyne would have been played by Zooey Deschanel, who would have been introduced in the Ant-Man movie and then officially become the Wasp in the Avengers. Now, another important fact that you should know before we jump into this is that Joss Whedon didn't write the Avengers script. He rewrote it. Zach Penn wrote the Avengers script, and the movie was already in pre-production when Whedon joined the project. So when he requested to rewrite the script, there were a few sequences that he was not allowed to change, because they were already being worked on. Namely, the famous fight scene between Iron Man and Thor, which is 100% from Zach Penn's script. So what did Joss Whedon change? For the most part, he added his trademark snappy dialogue, and he rearranged the final battle, making it easier to follow and giving it a 3-act structure. And it was his work on this very pivotal climax that convinced the heads of Marvel Studios to allow him to move forward with his rewrite. So, did Joss Whedon make any legitimately substantial changes to Zach Penn's work? Yes, he added a second villain. You see, just like in the original comic, Loki was supposed to be the only villain. But this didn't sit right with Whedon, who felt, and I quote, that you had these legitimate tough guys going against an effete British actor. And what does effete mean? It means wimpy or effeminate. Yeah, that's a pretty messed up thing to say. For this reason, in his version, Loki would have had a partner in villainy, who would have been none other than Ezekiel Stane, Obadiah Stane's son, who we just officially met in Ironheart 13 years later. And now for the most important question of this video. What would the original Avengers movie been like had everything gone according to the original plan? Well, thanks to a ton of information that emerged when Ironheart premiered, we have a really good idea. For starters, the main person being manipulated by Loki in the movie would not have been Eric Selvig. That would have been Ezekiel Stane, who, like his counterpart from Ironheart, would have actually been a really decent guy, who would have been way too smart to fall for the BS cover story of his father dying in a plane crash, and simply would have wanted to know the truth about his father's demise. Now, do you guys remember the post-credit scene from Thor? In it, we see Nick Fury recruiting Eric Selvig for Project Pegasus, and then it's implied that Loki is either controlling Selvig or masquerading as him. and we never get any clarification of this. Well, that's because, like I said, before all the changes, this was supposed to be Ezekiel Stane, who Loki would have discovered on Earth via the use of the Mind Stone, as the perfect candidate to help him execute his plans, and would have manipulated Zeke by convincing him that Tony Stark brutally murdered his father, and offering him the opportunity to get his revenge, in return for some minor assistance. Also, another important plot point, Fury recruiting Zeke would have been a major point of contention between him and Tony Stark, as he would have recruited a Stane to work on a project that was once headed by his father, Howard. This is why Tony doesn't trust Fury, as opposed to in the finished film, where he's just like, you know what, Fury's got way too many secrets, so I'm just gonna rudely spy on him for no reason. And thus, the script opens pretty much exactly like the finished film, at Project Pegasus, where the Tesseract is acting up. But in this version, the project is headed by Ezekiel Stane and Hope Van Dyne, who would have been very different from the version that we ended up getting, and would have been more akin to Whedon's favorite female archetype, the quirky nerd girl. Also, Hope is in the script a lot, so much so that Whedon refers to this version as being very waspy. Anyway, do you guys remember in the finished film how the Tesseract just turns itself on and then a portal opens and Loki pops out and there's no explanation for that? That's because Ezekiel Stane was supposed to be responsible for all of that. This would have been the moment where he would have betrayed the others and brought Loki to Earth to exact his revenge. The rest of the scene would have flowed the same. Loki and Zeke grab the Tesseract and leave while the open portal destroys Project Pegasus, which forces Nick Fury to assemble the Avengers. The recruitment scenes would have been largely the same with a few minor differences. For starters, it would have been Agent Mariah Hill, not Black Widow, who would have recruited Bruce Banner, as Natasha doesn't exist in this version. Sadly, that means that kick-ass introduction scene, which Whedon is 100% responsible for, wouldn't have existed either. In its place, we would have cut to Ant-Man using his powers to break into what appears to be a secure facility in the middle of the night, only to reveal that what he broke into is a closed convenience store, in order to grab a few school supplies for his daughter Cassie, whose first day of school is in the morning. So Scott goes to the register to leave some money behind to pay for the items that he took, when suddenly he finds Hope just casually standing behind the register, which, understandably, would have scared the crap out of him. She would have proceeded to tell Scott about what happened at Project Pegasus and Zeke's betrayal, and that she knows what he's going to do next, and needs Scott's help for a special task. The scene would have concluded with Scott realizing that he's short on funds, and sheepishly asking Hope to lend him a few bucks so he can pay for Cassie's school supplies. And thus, just like in the finished film, Captain America and Banner join Fury on the helicarrier, where he uses his vast resources to find Loki in Germany, where he sends Cap to confront him. Of course, we all know that this is just a distraction so Hawkeye can steal the iridium that they need for the portal machine. But Hawkeye doesn't exist in this version, so here these efforts would have been led by Zeke. Now, do you remember that special task that Hope recruited Scott for? Well, the brainy babe would have been well aware that in order for Zeke to build his own portal machine, he would need the iridium. So her plan was to have Scott steal it first in order to curtail Zeke's efforts. Unfortunately, Scott runs into Zeke, which leads into a confrontation between the two. At that exact same time, Hope is discovered by Agent Hill, directing Scott via the computer in her lab on the S.H.I.E.L.D. helicarrier. Believing Hope to be yet another betrayer, Hill would have ordered her men to detain Hope, and would have dispatched a few agents to arrest Scott, who would have gotten in Ant-Man's way, allowing Zeke to escape, which would then lead to Scott being brought onto the helicarrier in handcuffs, just like Loki. After a long but adorable explanation from Hope, Fury would have reluctantly agreed to let Scott go. This would have led into the scene in which Zeke shows up with a bunch of goons to free Loki, and they inadvertently cause Bruce to turn into the Hulk and go on a rampage. Just like in the finished film, the Avengers jump into action, but their jobs are a little bit different. It is Ant-Man, not Cap, who helps Tony fix the helicarrier by shrinking down inside the helicarrier's inner workings and rerouting some energy conduits via Tony's instructions. Cap stays on the bridge and fights off Loki's forces to prevent them from taking out another engine. And it is Maria Hill, not Black Widow, who gets chased by the Hulk through the bowels of the ship. But the hero that shows up to save her is not Thor, but Hope Van Dyne, making what would have been her first appearance in the MCU as the Wasp. Wasp would have heroically flown around the Hulk, mercilessly blasting him over and over again with her stingers. And as much as he would have tried to get a hold of her, he wouldn't be able to because she's just too fast. Eventually, he would have gotten so fed up that he would have knocked her away with a well-placed Hulk clap. Wasp would then hit the ground completely disoriented, only to look up just in time to see the Hulk about to stump her into paste. And that is when Thor would have come in for the save. This would have led into the same epic showdown between the two from the finished film. But instead of being saved by some rando in a fighter jet, Thor would have been saved by Wasp, who would have defeated the Hulk by flying into his ear and firing a stinger directly into his ear canal, which is exactly what she does in the Ultimates. This would cause the Hulk to lose his equilibrium and fall out of the helicarrier's wishbone. Thor would have tried to catch him, but he's just not fast enough. And as Hulk falls, Hope would have sadly lamented that that is not what she meant to do. We all know what happens next. Loki kills Agent Coulson and gets away, leaving the Avengers feeling defeated. Until Tony figures out that Loki and Zeke are gonna set up the portal device from the top of Stark Tower to add insult to injury. And so we go into the final battle, where we see the Avengers assemble in New York to stop Loki from taking over the world with the Chitauri army that he brought through the portal that Zeke helped him open. The final climactic battle remains largely the same with a few minor differences. For starters, there's a running gag of Ant-Man finding himself unable to find enough ants around so he can use them during the battle. Remember that, because it's gonna be important later. The now iconic moment where the Hulk takes out a Leviathan with one punch would have belonged, believe it or not, to Ant-Man. The moment would have gone like this. Loki would have been riding on top of the Leviathan, referred to in the script as a jumbo. And honestly, I prefer that name. Where he would have been confronted by Ant-Man. Loki, however, would have easily flicked him away, and Scott, still shrunken, would have bounced on a few things on the way down and would have landed roughly but safely on the street below. Loki would have then used the Mind Stone to get in his head and chastise him for being the least powerful. That while he might surround himself with gods, at the end of the day he's just a regular man who can shrink and talk to ants, capping off his criticism by saying, "What else do you have to offer?" To which Scott would have responded, "Oh, I have something for you," as he switched the controls on his suit from shrink to grow and turns into Giant Man for what would have been the first time ever in the MCU, taking out the Jumbo with one epic punch that would have sent Loki flying across the city and crashing into Stark Tower, where eventually he would have gotten smashed by the Hulk. Now, as cool as this version of the scene is, I am so glad that in the finished film this moment went to the Hulk, as to this day, it remains my favorite Hulk moment in the entire MCU. Meanwhile, Tony confronts Zeke atop of Stark Tower, and Tony gets him to stop being a colossal a-hole by simply showing him the climax of the first Iron Man movie, which apparently Jarvis conveniently recorded through Tony's suit. After seeing the footage, Zeke looks around and realizes just how much pain and suffering he has caused, and agrees to help close the portal. But unfortunately, Tony doesn't have time for that, as he has to go deal with a nuclear missile that's headed in their direction. So while Iron Man goes to take care of that very important matter, Zeke is assisted by the most powerful Avenger, the Wasp. Now, you guys remember how I said that that running gag of Ant-Man not having enough ants was going to be important? Well, we get to the point in the battle where the Avengers are getting overwhelmed by the endless barrage of Chitauri that keep pouring out of the portal. The Avengers look to Cap for direction, but the Sentinel of Liberty simply says, "We need an army." To which Ant-Man says, "I got your army right here, Cap." Scott then fires all of his PIM discs at a large group of ants that finally made it to the battle, turning them giant and commanding them to destroy the Chitauri, which they do. Fun fact, when this moment wasn't used in this movie, they then intended to use it in Ant-Man and the Wasp, but couldn't find a place for it. Then they planned to use it in Avengers Endgame, but they decided against it, as Thanos' forces would have been defeated a little too easily. And then finally they used it in Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania. But unfortunately, in that movie, it really didn't have that much impact. Meanwhile, back at the top of Stark Tower, Zeke and Wasp can't get past the force field to shut down the portal machine. But instead of using a convenient Achilles heel that was subconsciously built into the machine, Wasp uses actual science to solve the problem. You see, she surmises that because the force field is transparent, that light can get through it. So, theoretically, if she shrinks herself down small enough to ride the light waves, she should be able to move through the force field. Scott overhears this over their comm system and begs her not to do it, as they lost her mother in a very similar fashion. But Hope tells him that if her mother was on that rooftop wearing that suit, nothing in the world would stop her from doing what needs to be done. So she has to do this. And so, Wasp shrinks down, rides the light waves through the force field, and shoots the portal machine with her stingers, severing its connection to the Tesseract, effectively closing the portal right as Iron Man falls back through right after delivering the payload. Oh, and here's another fun fact. Instead of the Chitauri conveniently dying after Iron Man blew up their ship, they are eaten by the giant ants. And so our story ends. The Avengers arrest Loki, who is then taken back to Asgard by Thor. Zeke surrenders himself to the proper authorities. The Avengers go their separate ways, and our movie closes with Agent Hill questioning what they will do if they ever need the Avengers again. And Fury reassures her that when that time comes, when we need them the most, they will reassemble. Nice. And now for the second most important question of this video, why didn't this happen? Well, that was due to the greatest enemy of filmmaking, creative differences. Fun fact, Edgar Wright's Ant-Man movie was actually in pre-production long before the MCU was even conceived. It was only after Marvel Entertainment finalized the deals to move forward with the MCU that the production of Ant-Man was folded into the new multi-film project. So for many years, what Edgar Wright planned to make was a standalone movie. Then suddenly, he was being told by his new bosses that what he was actually making was a small chapter of a larger story. So, suffice it to say, there was a difference of opinion on how to move forward. So eventually Edgar Wright left the project, and there just wasn't enough time to put another Ant-Man movie into production. Plus, at the same time that was happening, after the unprecedented success of Iron Man, Marvel Studios was under a lot of pressure to produce another big hit. So they gave Ant-Man's spot to Iron Man 2, and the Phase 1 plan was slightly reworked, with Ant-Man and the Wasp being replaced by Black Widow and Hawkeye. So if those characters felt completely tacked on in the movies that they were introduced, that is because they were. Now, as far as Ezekiel Stane is concerned, that is the first thing that Joss Whedon was asked to remove from his script, as apparently Kevin Feige's biggest mandate as far as the Avengers movie was concerned was that no one was allowed to introduce any new characters in the movie, that the film should only feature characters and concepts that had been pre-established in the previous movies. So good old Zeke Stane went the way of Ant-Man and the Wasp, only to reemerge in a later project. And Tom Hiddleston went on to prove that he could carry an entire movie as a sole villain in every single scene that he was in. And the rest, as you know, is history. But what do you think? Are you still curious to see that version of the movie, or are you happy with the movie that we ended up getting? Let me know in the comment section below, as we have once again reached the end of this video. So, do you know of any fanboy films or shows that almost happened? Let me know at erod@inbox.com. And who knows, your suggestion might just end up being the topic of the next Legends of Fandom. Until then, I'm Erod, and I'm the Blockbuster Buster.